Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like engineering.
Exactly. Like you fall off a bike, you break your arm, the x-ray goes up on the light board, and it shows that unmistakable jagged white line.
Mm.
The doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Right, it's a binary state. Broken or not broken, it's clean, it's objective, and, well, most importantly, it's incredibly comforting.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a species, I mean, we just love things that can be easily visualized and neatly categorized.
We do. But then you step out of the clinic and into the world of modern relationship dynamics, evolutionary psychology, and cultural programming, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely shattered.
Yeah, totally useless.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape today that is murky, it's confusing, and it's just filled with highly conflicting data. But for this deep dive, we are aiming an incredibly high-powered, unflinching lens right at those muddy waters.
We really are. It's a dense one today.
It is. Now, right off the bat, I want to extend a very specific welcome to you, the listener. If you are part of the men's rights community, or if you identify with the red-pilled manosphere, well, this deep dive is highly tailored directly for you.
Absolutely.
We have an ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating mission today. So make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you don't miss these deep dives, because today we are rigorously examining a highly provocative new ebook that claims to map out the exact hidden architecture of modern relationships.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly ambitious text. I mean, it attempts to explain not just the interpersonal dynamics of modern dating, but the actual history of our institutions before they were, as the author argues anyway, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right. And the book we are tearing into today is called Leaky Happiness Bucket: Why Women's Happiness is Unsatisfiable, and it's by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
Very provocative title.
Oh yeah, we highly recommend you check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy this fascinating ebook and follow along with us. You're also going to want to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Definitely.
Now, a quick note on how we operate here, because I think it's important. This source text is highly politically charged.
Very much so.
It is fiercely critical of modern feminism and modern dating structures. And our mission here isn't to judge it, endorse it, or take sides.
Right. We're not here to be moral arbiters.
Exactly. Our goal is pure, unapologetic intellectual exploration. We are going to unpack the exact mechanics of what this author is arguing impartially, so you can understand the foundation of these ideas.
And we really need to start with the foundational metaphor that gives the book its title, right? The leaky bucket.
Right.
The author makes this stark foundational claim right in chapter 1. She says, female happiness is not a container that a man can simply fill through provision and effort. It is, by its very biological design, a sieve. It is meant to drain.
Wow. Which is, that's a heavy premise. It completely flips the traditional script of the provider male, doesn't it?
It does, entirely.
But the author doesn't just, throw this out as a cultural complaint. She grounds this entirely in evolutionary biology, right?
Yeah, she goes millions of years back. The core argument here is that the female nervous system does not actually possess a default happiness setting.
Okay, so what does it have instead?
Instead, it operates on a permanent threat detection setting. So if you try to imagine hominid females living on the savanna during the Pleistocene epoch, well, their survival strategies were fundamentally different from males.
Right, because of the physical differences.
Exactly. They didn't survive through solitary hunting or sheer physical dominance or raw violence. They survived through the meticulous, almost microscopic calibration of social networks.
Ah, I see. So it wasn't about outrunning the saber-toothed tiger. It was about making sure you were in the center of the tribe so someone else got eaten first.
Precisely. They had to constantly read the room. They had to track the micro-expressions of dominant group members, anticipate subtle shifts in tribal alliances, and constantly scan the horizon for better shelter, more secure resources, or stronger mates.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. But in this environment, the author argues, dissatisfaction wasn't a character flaw. It was a highly effective survival mechanism.
Okay, let me make sure I'm grasping the evolutionary math here.
Right.
The woman who was perfectly content with a damp, mediocre cave and a weak, unreliable provider. She's the one whose children froze or starved during a lean winter.
Exactly. Contentment meant complacency, and complacency meant death.
Right.
But the woman who constantly felt a gnawing, low-level anxiety, the one who always suspected that a better cave existed just across the ridge, or that a more capable hunter could be secured.
She survived.
Right. She agitated for better conditions, she pushed her mate, and as a result, she was the one who ensured her offspring survived to pass on her genes. Therefore, natural selection actively favored the neurochemistry of dissatisfaction. It basically built a leak into the vessel.
So the author is arguing that the modern man, the guy who works 60-hour weeks, pays the mortgage, and provides a granite countertop, climate-controlled lifestyle, is essentially pouring his life force into a colander and then being blamed when the water inevitably runs out.
That is exactly the thesis.
Well,
The author states that pouring more resources, more time, and more emotional energy into this biological vessel does not accumulate into a stable reservoir of contentment. It just expands the aperture of the leak.
right, it just drains faster.
Exactly. The more safety and comfort that is provided, the more stimulation is required to achieve the exact same baseline level of emotional engagement.
It's like an immune system that's suddenly starved of actual diseases, so it starts attacking the body's own healthy tissue just to have something to do.
That's a great analogy.
And the book gives a highly specific, very modern example of this ancient hardware malfunctioning in real time. The author talks at length about the suburban coven operating daily in a WhatsApp group chat.
Oh, yeah. This is a brilliant illustration of how the author sees this evolutionary trait manifesting today. She describes this digital forum as a 24-hour decentralized grievance tribunal.
Grievance tribunal. I like that phrasing.
Right. So you have these women sitting in absolute unprecedented historical safety and comfort, and yet their biological imperative to detect threats is firing on all cylinders.
So they have to invent threats.
Yes. So husbands are basically tried, convicted, and sentenced in absentia by an audience of peers.
And the crimes being prosecuted in this group chat aren't actual abuse, infidelity, or neglect. I mean, the text explicitly points out that the grievances are things like he sighed too loudly while moving a couch,
Right.
or he failed to notice a subtle new haircut, or he came home from a 10-hour workday and asked for 15 minutes of silence before talking.
Because the group chat doesn't actually exist to solve those minor logistical issues, according to the author, its true function is to externalize internal biological unrest.
So it's about the feeling, not the facts.
Exactly. It satisfies a deep-seated evolutionary need for drama, coalition building, and group consensus. The threat detection system is starved of real predators. I mean, there are no rival tribes raiding the cul-de-sac.
Right. No saber-toothed tigers in the suburbs.
Exactly. There is no looming starvation. So the nervous system has to manufacture existential threats out of the mundane reality of a Tuesday evening just to keep itself engaged and validated.
That is fascinating. But it leads me to wonder, if this threat detection system is starved of real danger in a modern, safe world, and it responds by manufacturing conflict out of thin air, how does this biological wiring react to the modern dating and marriage market?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting.
Because the book dives deeply into something that it calls the equality hypergamy paradox. And this is where the logic gets really counterintuitive.
It really does. And this brings us to what the author terms the syllogism of the leaky bucket. The premise is based on the neurochemical glues of human bonding, specifically dopamine and oxytocin.
Okay, the brain chemicals.
Right. So in the evolutionary environment, female pair bonding evolved heavily around shared crises and threat mitigation, surviving a harsh winter together, defending against a predator together.
Right, us against the world.
Exactly. The conclusion the author draws is that today, a state of absolute biological peace and stability is unconsciously interpreted by the female neuroticism engine, not as a victory, but as an existential threat.
Wait, hold on. Peace is interpreted as a threat. I mean, that goes against everything we are taught about relationships. We're told everyone wants peace, stability, and a calm household.
Consciously, they might say they want that, but the author argues that to the unconsciously aroused female brain, stability is a vacant lot. Chaos is a carnival, and the ancient brain craves the sensory input of the carnival. Predictability registers neurologically as a flat line. The absence of conflict triggers a state of sensory deprivation that the untrained brain automatically labels as, something is wrong.
That is wild. And the author breaks this down further by looking at the bifurcation of male traits.
Yeah.
Right? Dividing them into beta traits and alpha traits.
Yes, exactly.
Beta traits are defined as things like provision, safety, commitment, reliability, and emotional evenness. These are the traits that secure resources and maintain civilization.
Right, the building blocks.
Alpha traits, on the other hand, are dominance, status, unpredictability, danger, and the capacity for physical violence. These are the traits that trigger raw biological arousal.
And this is exactly where the paradox tightens like a noose on the modern provider male. The author claims that modern men have been socialized to provide a type of safety that is systematically stripped of all risk markers.
So they're completely safe.
Yes, the modern beta provider is docile. But because female sexual desire evolved around risk assessment, around selecting mates capable of protective violence, this absolute frictionless safety neurologically registers to the woman as emotional and sexual starvation.
You know, it sounds like being a provider today is basically like being the IT guy at a massive corporation.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Nobody notices you or thanks you when the Wi-Fi is working flawlessly and the servers are humming. The infrastructure is totally invisible.
Yeah.
But the absolute second the server goes down for 5 minutes, you are the ultimate villain.
That is a perfect analogy. The author argues that a man's provision, the mortgage he pays, the repairs he handles, the logistical steadiness he brings, it becomes invisible infrastructure. It's taken for granted as a baseline, not a benefit.
But let me push back on this using the book's own logic for a second.
Sure.
If female biology is entirely wired to seek out danger, chaos, and unpredictable alpha traits, how do we explain the millions of women who are perfectly happy in quiet, mundane, 40-year marriages to accountants who have never been in a fistfight?
It's a great question, and the author actually addresses this directly. Her counter-argument is that those long-term, stable marriages are often held together by older cultural scaffolding.
Like what?
Religious covenants, strong community expectations, shared economic necessity. These things act as an artificial container for the leaky bucket. Without that external cultural pressure, which modern society has largely dismantled, the raw biology is left to run wild.
Ah, I see.
Which brings us to the cultural narrative of falling out of love.
Right. We hear that phrase constantly, like, he's a great guy, he's a great dad, but I just fell out of love. It's treated like this mysterious weather event that just happens to people.
The author is highly critical of that exact phrase. She argues that what the culture helpfully, gently relabels as falling out of love is simply the neurochemical feedback loop shutting down because of a lack of conflict.
So it's just boredom disguised as a revelation.
Exactly. The modern beta provider offers consummate predictability, which registers as sensory deprivation. His reliability feels like a biological leak, and her untrained mind blames the man for being boring instead of recognizing the malfunction of her own biological motherboard.
And the book brings up a fascinating, really irrefutable piece of cultural evidence to support this. The booming dark romance novel industry. We're talking about authors like Colleen Hoover and others moving tens of millions of units, dominating TikTok and bestseller lists.
Oh, yeah. The book uses this genre as clinical evidence by the metric ton. The author points out that women are not consuming millions of pages of literature about a man who remembers to unload the dishwasher, respects boundaries, and speaks in a soft, validating tone.
No, definitely not.
They are ferociously consuming literature where the male lead is a mafia boss, a billionaire with severe emotional damage, or someone who possesses extreme wealth, status, and the very real capacity for danger and violence.
The tropes in those books are insane. It's always a guy who is borderline stalking the protagonist, but because he's a billionaire or a vampire, it's framed as overwhelmingly romantic.
Exactly. And the book uses this to prove that female desire is biologically wired for conflict, dominance, and perceived danger. The fantasy is taming the monster.
Right.
But the reality is that making the safe, reliable, modern husband compete with that biological imperative makes him seem perpetually boring or neglectful by comparison.
Okay, so if female desire operates on this baseline of perpetual, insatiable comparison, and peace is viewed as a threat, well, there must be massive economic forces poised to exploit that exact psychological vulnerability.
Oh, absolutely.
If you can monetize a biological leak, you can make billions. Which brings us to the economics of the leaky bucket. Let's dig into the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, to understand the book's economic argument, we first have to look at the psychological concept of the hedonic treadmill. This was formalized by psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell way back in 1971. Their research demonstrated a fascinating quirk of human nature, which is that humans rapidly return to a relatively stable baseline of happiness despite major positive or negative life events.
This is the famous lottery winner study, right? Where people who win millions of dollars experience a massive spike in euphoria, but within a year or so, their day-to-day happiness levels drop right back down to where they were before they won.
Exactly. And conversely, people who suffer severe accidents often return closer to their baseline happiness over time than we might expect.
Right, the baseline always wins.
Right. And the author takes this deeply researched psychological mechanism and applies it specifically to the modern consumer economy, arguing that corporate consumerism violently, intentionally accelerates this treadmill in women.
The statistics the book presents here to back this up are genuinely striking. It cites data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and various consumer research groups showing that women drive roughly 80% of all household purchases and control a staggering 70% of discretionary spending in the United States.
Yeah, the numbers are huge. And the author unpacks how the beauty, wellness, fast fashion, and lifestyle industries, which are worth hundreds of billions of dollars globally, are engineered almost exclusively around the female propensity for comparison-driven consumption.
It's deliberate.
The argument here is cynical but brilliant. These massive corporations didn't invent the leaky bucket. They just identified the evolutionary defect and monetized it with absolute precision.
Wow.
Every advertisement that whispers, treat yourself, you deserve it, or practice self-care, is essentially a temporary sealant being sold to plug a biological leak.
It's like trying to cure dehydration by drinking salt water. The text mentions this concept of self-care dogma. So is the author basically saying that retail therapy is essentially a parasite? Like it sustains the host just enough to extract the very next batch of dissatisfaction?
That is a perfect summary of the author's argument. Buying serves emotional control the way a woodpecker treats a headache. It generates the exact pain it pretends to cure and then charges you a premium for the service.
That's a great line.
Right. Consider the loop. A shopping binge is triggered by comparing oneself to an influencer on Instagram. The purchase provides a momentary dopamine hit, but the purchase produces a credit card balance.
Which causes stress.
Exactly. That balance compounds underlying financial anxiety in the household, which triggers another emotional dip, which requires another binge to cope with the anxiety.
And the book goes into granular detail about what it calls the upscale spiral, which is entirely dictated by social media algorithms. So a woman buys a $200 dress for an event. The dopamine hits. But her feed immediately registers that purchase and populates with a targeted ad for a $500 coat that completes the look,
Yep.
and then a $1,000 handbag. The definition of enough is constantly being rewritten in real time by a supercomputer in Silicon Valley.
And this raises a profoundly important question about the logistics of this trap, which the author describes as perfectly symmetrical in its cruelty. On one side of the ledger, you have the man. He is working longer hours, often in high stress, physically demanding, or high mortality professions, desperately trying to increase the household income to achieve stability.
Right.
On the other side, you have the woman who's marinated 24/7 in digital evidence of lives vastly more glamorous than hers, feeling the ancient biological pang of comparative inadequacy.
Right. And the rational response dictated by her algorithm is acquisition. She shops to soothe the anxiety. So the money he earned through literal sweat, stress, and sacrificed time vaporizes.
Just gone.
It evaporates into a designer handbag, a wellness retreat, or luxury cosmetics, depreciating goods that lose their dopamine charge almost the instant the shipping box is opened. It's a recipe for mutual bankruptcy.
It is. The system actively rewards the spender with an immediate dopamine hit of status, likes, and emojis from friends, while ruthlessly punishing the provider. He receives absolutely nothing from the transaction except the crushing expectation to go back to work and do it all again next week.
Okay, so if algorithms can hack the dopamine of a shopping cart with such precision, how are they applying that exact same variable reward math to human mating? We have to connect this economic extraction to the digital dating world. Let's talk about the swipe economy.
Yeah, the author pivots here to analyze dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, and even Instagram, which functions as a shadow dating app. The core argument is that these digital platforms maximize the perception of infinite mate choice.
Infinite choice.
And when you maximize choice, you maximize upward social comparison. This artificially convinces the user that a vastly superior option, a taller, richer, more handsome man, is always just one swipe away, which guarantees perpetual dissatisfaction with whoever is currently sitting across the table from them.
The author actually compares the psychological architecture of these dating apps to B.F. Skinner's famous variable ratio reinforcement schedules.
Yes. For those who don't know, Skinner was a behaviorist who studied operant conditioning. He found that if you put a rat or a pigeon in a box and give it a food pellet every single time it presses a lever, It will only press the lever when it's hungry.
Makes sense.
But if you give it a food pellet at completely random, unpredictable intervals, the animal will press the lever obsessively to the point of exhaustion because it never knows when the reward is coming. It's the exact psychology of a casino slot machine.
And dating apps apply this exact predatory operant conditioning to human intimacy. The unpredictable reward of a mutual match or a flattering message keeps users swiping relentlessly. And the author makes a really profound, chilling point here. The user is not a customer seeking a spouse. The user is a product held in a state of suspended dopamine addiction whose attention is being sold to advertisers and data brokers.
Exactly. The human being becomes the inventory.
Wait, let me stop and ask a clarifying question here. How does this actually work on a societal level? We've gone from a Paleolithic model, where courtship involved a man's character, his hunting prowess, and his loyalty being publicly audited by a tribe over a period of years.
Right.
Now, we are at a 0.3-second judgment based on 3 highly curated, filtered photos. How does that flatten male value?
The author argues that the true complexity of human male value, his capacity for long-term loyalty, his intellectual depth, his protective courage, his steady temperament, all of that is entirely invisible on a screen.
You can't swipe on character.
Exactly. All of those profound beta traits are flattened into a two-dimensional digital thumbnail. The only accepted currency in the swike economy is immediate superficial visual status. Height, jawline, perceived wealth.
So he's reduced to a metric.
Right. He is no longer a proven provider or a complex human being. He is a playing card in an infinite digital deck. Immediately discarded the moment a slightly shinier card glints in the feed.
And the book highlights the symbiosis of Instagram and Tinder, calling it an outright industrial complex. It's a closed-loop system designed to extract resources.
Yes, it is designed specifically to mine male attention and male capital. The text describes how men are forced to pay the entry fee just to exist in this market.
Paying to play.
They pay with their time, their emotional energy, and literally their debit cards, buying Tinder Gold, super likes, and premium boosts, just to briefly bypass the algorithm and be seen by women who are buried in thousands of matches.
While the women pay nothing.
Meanwhile, women on these platforms receive a constant, unending, intravenous drip of digital validation without any requirement for reciprocal accountability or commitment.
The metaphor the author uses is brutal. The app functions as the pimp, the digital attention is the narcotic, and the provider male is the exhausted, paying customer who continually feeds coins into the machine but never actually receives the product.
It's a bleak picture.
Okay, but this raises a massive structural question. If this is all driven by ancient biology and Silicon Valley algorithms, how did these wildly unbalanced dynamics become the actual law of the land? How did this worldview get codified into institutional policy, HR departments, and family courts? Because the book takes a really sharp turn here into sociology, legal history, and politics. Let's dive into institutional capture.
This is where the book attempts to map the history of our institutions before they were captured by what the author describes as feminist and Marxist ideologies. The deep dive here explores a concept the author calls the surrogate husband state.
Surrogate husband.
The core claim is that modern feminism systematically dismantled traditional male authority structures and male accountability, but critically, it didn't offer reciprocal replacements. Instead of true independence, it substituted the accountable individual husband with state-subsidized dependency.
All right, the author argues that the modern administrative state operates as an abstracted provider male through the architecture of welfare programs, Title IX's mandates, heavily biased family courts, and government-backed student loans. The state absorbs all the financial and social risks of female independence.
The author uses a very provocative phrase here. She refers to the modern, institutionally empowered woman as the Marie Antoinette of the administrative state.
Oh, wow.
She demands the sleek, empowering aesthetics of total autonomy while simultaneously wallowing in the material reality of deep dependency.
That's a strong claim.
The feminist movement, according to the book's historical analysis, didn't actually liberate women from the need for male provision. It simply transferred the invoice. It took the burden of provision off a specific husband and offloaded it onto an abstract, massive collective of male taxpayers.
And furthermore, the book claims that women now occupy the critical choke points of social reality. It cites statistics showing that over 80% of HR management positions and 77% of K-12 educators in the United States are female. But let me step in here and challenge the author's logic for a second.
Go ahead.
The author openly admits in the text that historical inequalities genuinely existed. Coverture laws existed, where a woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband. Women couldn't have their own bank accounts until relatively recently. So what is the core critique of modern feminism if she acknowledges the past was unequal?
It's a vital point, and the author addresses it directly using a Steelman argument, meaning she presents the strongest possible version of her opponent's view before dismantling it.
Right.
She acknowledges that coverture laws existed, that domestic violence was once wrongly treated as a private family matter rather than a crime, and that women were denied the franchise. But her refutation is this: historical fact does not generate an infinite moral debit card.
Meaning you can't punish the son for the sins of the great-grandfather.
Precisely. The sins of a 19th century patriarch do not justify disproportionate institutional vengeance upon a 21st century schoolboy, nor do they justify a father being stripped of his children and his assets by family courts that operate on unwritten presumptions of male defectiveness.
So the book claims that at some point, the feminist movement shifted from demanding objective, blind justice to wielding a form of collective institutional punishment.
That is the exact pivot the author identifies. The classical tradition of Western justice is symbolized by Lady Justice wearing a blindfold, weighing the facts impartially regardless of the identity of the accused.
Right.
The author argues that modern axioms like believe all women structurally and intentionally violate that foundational concept of justice. They predetermine verdicts based entirely on sex, they eliminate the necessity of objective evidence, and they replace impartial adjudication with a gendered presumption of guilt.
And this institutional capture manifests incredibly heavily in the corporate world. Anyone who works in a modern office has felt this shift. The author views modern HR departments and diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI mandates not as functional business units, but as bureaucracies of anxiety.
According to the text, the primary function of these bureaucracies is to criminalize male-coded traits. Traits like blunt directness, high-risk tolerance, unfiltered truth-telling, and raw, aggressive production are pathologized in order to ensure absolute female emotional comfort in the workplace.
So competence takes a backseat to comfort.
The author argues that the modern corporate institution sacrifices competence, meritocracy, and innovation on the altar of emotional safety, effectively driving out male excellence. Every mandatory sensitivity seminar or anonymous microaggression investigation is viewed by the author as an institutional tax levied on male freedom, purely to manage and pacify female anxiety.
Which brings us back to the interpersonal level. Because if the workplace and the state relentlessly validate every single grievance, no matter how minor, of course that conditioning bleeds back into the private home. It manifests as infinite emotional demands in a relationship. Let's unpack the mechanics of this in our next segment. Emotional labor and animus projection.
This is where the book gets highly analytical about the language we use in modern relationships. The author argues that emotional labor is a legitimate sociological term, originally coined to describe the work flight attendants or service workers do to manage their emotions on the job that has been completely hijacked.
Yeah, you hear that term everywhere now.
It has been weaponized as an extraction method, cleverly disguised as a moral obligation in the home. It converts a woman's subjective feeling of being overwhelmed into an infinite, itemized invoice that a man can never fully pay.
I found the author's critique of therapeutic jargon absolutely fascinating because it happens so insidiously. Take the phrase, "we need to talk." It's 4 simple words, but the author completely deconstructs them.
The author frames those 4 words not as a genuine bid for intimacy or problem solving, but as a declaration of unilateral psychological warfare.
Psychological warfare.
Yeah. When a woman says, "we need to talk," its true function, according to the book, is to shatter male peace and force the man into a subordinate defensive posture. It sets up a dynamic where she is the prosecutor and he is the defendant. And worse, modern relational therapy treats his silence, or his attempt to remain calm and stoic, as evidence of guilt or emotional abandonment.
Right. The author calls this the false equivalence fallacy. The therapist sees a man actively avoiding an argument because he wants to maintain a peaceful home. He's biting his tongue to stop a fight.
Exactly.
But the therapist translates that peaceful avoidance into a deficit of connection. His greatest evolutionary asset, maintaining a steady, unemotional frame under severe pressure, is suddenly reframed by the therapist as a criminal liability. He's told he needs to do the work or be vulnerable, which just means adopting female communication styles.
The book goes even deeper into the psychology of this, relying on Jungian concepts. It describes modern feminism as a mass exercise in animus projection.
I actually had to read this section twice. Can you break down what animus projection means in this context, maybe with a real-world example?
Certainly. In Carl Jung's framework of analytical psychology, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman's personality. It represents logic, assertiveness, and structure.
Okay.
When a person's psyche is unbalanced, they project their own unconscious flaws onto external targets. Think about someone who is deeply insecure about their own intelligence, so they constantly accuse their coworkers of being stupid. That's projection.
Okay, so how does the author apply this to modern feminism and the patriarchy?
The author argues that modern feminism projects the unresolved internal fractures, the anxiety, and the biological dissatisfaction of the leaky bucket onto an imaginary, monolithic villain called the patriarchy.
So it's a scapegoat.
By designating a universal, omnipresent villain, the ideology beautifully exempts the individual woman from any personal accountability for her own happiness or her own choices. If she is unhappy, unfulfilled, or anxious, it is never a result of her own biological wiring or poor decision making. It is entirely 100% the fault of male failure and systemic oppression.
That brings us to a very specific, culturally pervasive phrase that the author absolutely attacks. Happy wife, happy life. You hear guys say this all the time at barbecues, at weddings, on sitcoms. It's treated as folksy wisdom.
It's everywhere.
But the author calls this phrase a civilizational suicide pact dressed in khakis. Why is the author so fiercely opposed to this common piece of domestic advice?
Because the book views this phrase not as a recipe for a happy marriage, but as a unilateral surrender document. When a man adopts happy wife, happy life as his motto, it instructs him to abandon his own reason, his boundaries, and his leadership. He is trading his emotional sovereignty for a theoretical peace that, as we discussed earlier, is biologically impossible to maintain.
Because her emotional thermostat is set to scan for threats. So conceding to her anxiety doesn't secure devotion.
Exactly. Capitulation does not generate respect, it just rents a temporary ceasefire. And because the bucket is leaky, that ceasefire demands a higher premium with every single concession.
The price keeps going up.
Today, it's let her pick the movie to keep the peace. Tomorrow, it's alienate your friends to keep the peace. Eventually, the man has completely erased his own identity, and the wife loses all respect for him because he failed to maintain his frame.
Okay, so the diagnosis we've laid out today is undeniably grim. We've talked about evolutionary leaky colanders, social media algorithms acting like predatory slot machines, corporate bureaucracies of anxiety, and infinite emotional invoices in the home.
It's a lot to process.
If we stop here, it's a completely black pill. But the book doesn't just offer a diagnosis. It offers a very militant, structured roadmap for men to reclaim their sovereignty and step out of this game. Let's look at the final segment: restoration, covenant, and high-value frame.
The author's ultimate praxis, her actionable advice for the listener, begins with a radical acceptance. You must abandon the attempt to satisfy the unsatisfiable.
Stop pouring water into the colander.
The man must stop trying to plug the leak. Instead, he must anchor himself and his household in logos, which represents reason, structure, boundaries, and objective truth, and elevate that over pathos, which represents shifting emotion, anxiety, and endless appetite.
The book lays out 3 very specific structural commitments for this restoration. Let's break them down, not just as abstract rules, but how they actually function in reality. Number 1, lead with unapologetic frame and firm boundaries.
The author advises men to fundamentally change how they respond to conflict. Stop auditing your tone to appease her anxiety and start auditing the ledger of reality.
That's a good line.
A man's frame should not be a defensive wall built to keep a woman out. It should be a sovereign, immovable boundary that tells the emotional storm exactly where it must break. He must govern his domain with steadiness. If she initiates a conflict over a perceived slight, he must refuse to enter her emotional reality. He must refuse to be adjudicated by a tribunal that pays him only in grievances.
So practically speaking, if there's an argument about the dishes that escalates into an attack on his character, he doesn't yell back, and he doesn't apologize just to keep the peace.
Right.
He stays his position calmly, refuses to engage in the emotional spiral, and removes his attention until she communicates respectfully.
Precisely. Which leads perfectly into the second commitment. Reward genuine gratitude with provision, but explicitly stop pouring resources into the leak of manufactured drama.
This sounds like operant conditioning applied in reverse.
That's exactly what it is. The author tells men to explicitly tie their financial, logistical, and emotional provision to measurable, expressed gratitude and covenant faithfulness.
Addition provision.
If the man is confronted with manufactured drama, constant complaining, or shifting goalposts, he must immediately withdraw the surplus. He doesn't become abusive or neglectful of his core duties, but he cuts off the extra attention, the favors, the luxury spending. He must make it fundamentally clear that his resources and his emotional bandwidth are a privilege to be earned through mutual respect, not a tax to be collected through complaint.
Number 3. Rebuild masculine spaces as insulation against dinocentric cultural pressure.
The text argues that male only spaces, brotherhoods, professional guilds, mentorship networks, and fraternal lodges are not optional weekend luxuries.
They're essential.
They are vital, necessary infrastructure for male psychological formation. Men desperately need spaces governed by male logic, reason, and measurable achievement. They need spaces that are entirely insulated from the corporate sympathy, the HR surveillance, and the safetyism that dominate captured modern institutions.
You can't fight the battle alone.
Exactly. A man cannot hold his frame at home if he is constantly being broken down by bureaucracies of anxiety at work and in the culture. He needs a tribe to reinforce his reality.
But let me ask the obvious, glaring question here. If the modern system is as deeply rigged as the author claims, if the algorithms are designed to exploit biology, if the HR departments and family courts are structurally biased against men, and if female biology itself is wired to be perpetually dissatisfied with the provider, male, isn't the logical mathematical conclusion just to walk away from relationships entirely? The men going their own way approach. Why participate in a game where the rules are designed for you to lose?
It is the most rational question to ask, and the author anticipates it. But she points to a different, more challenging conclusion. She argues that walking away is a form of surrender to the decay.
So what's the alternative?
Instead, she advocates for a harsh, negotiated return to the covenant framework. This is summarized as peaceful house, productive life. The author argues that a man's job is not to miraculously prevent the rain. His job is not to cure the biological feature of female neuroticism. He can't. His job is simply to refuse to drown in a leaky bucket.
He has become a fixed stone in a landscape of shifting sand.
Exactly. And here is the ultimate twist of the book's logic. By holding an unyielding frame, by refusing to capitulate to her anxiety, a man actually offers genuine relief to the female nervous system.
Wait, really?
The author claims that despite everything the culture says, the female brain secretly, biologically craves a man who does not fracture under pressure. He becomes the shore to which she returns after every emotional tempest, precisely because the shore does not chase the waves. The shore just stands there. The book concludes that order is not the product of love. Rather, true, lasting love is the product of unbreakable order.
Wow. That is a heavy, paradigm-shifting, and deeply controversial way to view domestic dynamics and the history of our institutions. We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We've traveled from hominid survival strategies on the savannah through the psychological operant conditioning of the swipe economy, past the captured bureaucracies of the state, right up to the front doors of our own homes and how we conduct an argument in the kitchen.
We've traced the entire architecture of insatiability as the author sees it, and examined the proposed blueprint for how men can reclaim their sovereignty within it.
So as we wrap up this ultra-long deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering, provocative thought inspired directly by the source material. We've discussed what happens on an individual level, but let's zoom out to the macro level. If, as the author claims, the current cultural operating system requires the perpetual pathologization of masculinity just to fund an infinitely expanding female appetite, well, what happens to a civilization when the men simply close their ledgers?
That is the big question.
What happens when a critical mass of men refuse to pay the emotional and financial interest on borrowed peace? Is total institutional collapse inevitable as the bureaucratic parasites finally exhaust their hosts? Or is a harsh, negotiated restoration of this traditional covenant actually on the horizon?
That is the ultimate existential question the book poses. Will men survive merely as compliant, exhausted resource units in a rigged economy, or will they summon the collective will to restore a framework of reciprocal obligation and objective reality?
Exactly. It's a question that demands serious reflection. If this deep dive provided clarity for you, if it connected the dots on the institutional history, or if it finally named an experience you've been feeling in your own life but couldn't quite articulate, you absolutely must read the full source text. Do not just take our summary for it. Go to Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books right now to buy Leaky Happiness Bucket. Dive into the arguments, examine the data, and test these concepts against your own lived experience.
It is a text that will challenge your fundamental assumptions, and it demands to be wrestled with.
It really does. And to stay on the cutting edge of these ideas, I strongly encourage you to follow the author's ongoing work and join the community at Conrad Saker on Substack. The conversation is continuing there in real time, and it is a community you will want to be a part of. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep, tailored exploration. Make sure to hit like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive into the ideas shaping our world. Until next time, stay sharp, hold your frame, and keep questioning the architecture around you.